Okay, we're at, everybody, we're at 5:02. We want to get started here pretty quick.
Where's Martin?
He would go back. All right, welcome and good evening. This is our special meeting for the City of Federal Way Council for purposes of hearing a study session regarding Federal Way Transit Center Light Rail Station. Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, welcome. All right, with that, again, we're here for the study session for the Federal Way Transit Center Light Rail Station. First, we'll have introduction, Tony Doucette, Staff Liaison to Sound Transit. Tony?
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor Farrell, Deputy Mayor Honda, and council members. My name is Tony Doucette, and I'm in the Public Works Department working on sound transit projects within the city. When I presented the Federal Way Link Extension Development Agreement update at last month's Land Use and Transportation Committee, there were a few questions about surplus property surrounding the Federal Way Transit Center, and Sound Transit staff offered to come and further explain the process. So tonight, Tim Bates and Thatcher Imboden from Sound Transit Surplus Property Group are here to give the council a more detailed presentation on the process as a whole and opportunities at the Federal Way Transit Center. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tim and Thatcher and thank both of them for coming tonight.
Well, good evening, Mayor Farrell, Deputy Mayor Honda, and council members. I'm pleased to be here. I'm Tim Bates, and again, with me is Thatcher Imboden. We're with Sound Transit's Office of Land Use Planning and Development, and we're here to talk a little bit about surplus property and potential TOD at the Federal Way Transit Center. So just a quick overview of tonight's presentation. We'll talk a little bit about what surplus property is, and we'll talk about sort of Sound Transit's view on transit-oriented development. We'll also talk about the process to achieve that transit-oriented development, and then we'll tie it back to the Federal Way Transit Center in particular toward the end. And then, of course, there'll be time for questions and discussion. So why are we talking about surplus property? Well, surplus property is something that we don't have yet. Sound Transit acquires property to build and operate our regional transit system. And ultimately, that process generally, when we're doing that, building a major infrastructure project, we have to acquire property to do some staging and store construction, machinery and materials and all of that. And so as part of building the project, we end up having staging lands. And at some point at the end of the project, we come to being able to say, what, the transit purpose of that land is now fulfilled. We've managed to complete the piece that we needed to complete with it. And then we can go through a process with our board of directors to designate that property as quote unquote surplus. And then that allows us to think about what can happen on that property in the future. So, we're still some months away from groundbreaking on the transit center or on the Federal Way Link extension in general. We've got, we're still working through that process right now. Haven't quite picked our design builder, but in the coming months and year, you will start to see some traces of that. And actually, we've started to take control of some properties, even in the transit center area. So as we do that, we'll start to secure and monitor those properties. So it's, you'll start to see some traces of that as the year comes to a close and, start to get really that exciting period of time. So we wanted to come in and talk to you tonight to sort of set the stage for potential surplus property in the area of the transit center, and also to talk about TOD and, what Sound Transit needs to acquire or needs to achieve, and how we like to work with cities to do that. So that is generally the process. Really, once we're complete with construction, we work with our communities to figure out what the vision for any surplus property might be, and then our board decides, great, we've got a plan, we know how we want to move forward with this, we'll declare it surplus, and then we'll be able to go out and figure out how to achieve achieve that plan for the property. So, why do we talk about surplus property? Well, that's where Sound Transit can pursue things like transit-oriented development. So I'm going to talk a little bit generally about transit-oriented development first, and then we'll get into a little more detail. But I wanted to just introduce what is transit-oriented development, and some of you are probably very familiar with this, and others of you might be less. So we wanted to start by setting a base understanding here. So TOD is a land development pattern that integrates transit and land use, and really it tries to take that that opportunity to build a compact, walkable community around the station to support the station ridership, to enable people to live, work, and play near transit. And that's really what Sound Transit wants to see when we work with our jurisdictions around the region. And of course, as we do that, we want to make sure that we're doing development that matches with the community, right? There's no one-size-fits-all approach to this. So we've got an example here on the screen of the Capitol Hill TOD up in Seattle that's actually under construction now. So that's an example of what TOD can look like. And you can see in the bottom left there, that's actually our transit station. So it's very tightly integrated right next to the transit. So people can hop off the train and go right home and pick up maybe some groceries or some milk, or they're dry cleaning at the end of the day, that kind of thing. So we're really trying to leverage this major investment in the community with the transit by helping to build, add that little spark of activity around the station. So that's generally what TOD is, and again, it's done in partnership with our communities, because really we want the TOD to be reflective of the local land use and the zoning and the comp plan goals, all of that that you've done work to think about. We want our projects to fit nicely in with that. So when Sound Transit thinks of TOD, there's really two types. There's what we call community TOD, which is sort of development that might happen in the larger context around the station. So we generally think of about a 10-minute walk within the station, or about a half mile. And that's really development that could be done by really the private sector, right? It's development that the market would deliver because there's demand, that there's a new transit stop and everyone's starting to get excited about it. So that's community TOD. And then there's agency TOD, which is actually development that would happen on Sound Transit property. So if we have that surplus property, we can then pursue that agency TOD. And so that's what we're going to focus on tonight. Sound Transit is, of course, supportive of community TOD, but we don't really have a direct role to play in that. Obviously, that's an interplay between a developer and the city, the controls that you've got for achieving your goals in downtown. So we're going to talk about agency TOD in particular tonight. And so that's when Sound Transit really works to engage with the public and the private sectors and the nonprofits to bring development, or to bring a shared vision to that property. And so that can support our transit ridership, can create a great place in your city, and it achieves goals that we're all excited to see. So this will be my last slide, and then I'll hand it over to Thatcher. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that Sound Transit has a variety of both legislative regulations that we have to abide by when we think about TOD, but also voter-approved goals and objectives. And I've thrown a couple here up on the screen, really wanting to emphasize that our fundamental goal is to create these diverse, vibrant, mixed-use, mixed-income communities around our stations. And I think that's a vision that that we've seen as a regional goal as we think about growth in the region. And so that's part of what Sound Transit's mandate is. But of course, we want to do that in a way that's sensitive to the local environment. And we want to do that in a way that we've developed shared understanding and goals for development in the transit center area in particular, since we're here in Federal Way. And we also want to try to complete TOD as soon as we can after the transit project is opening, right? So we like to have the TOD open with the transit project as best we can. Now, sometimes, given the vagaries of the construction process, our first and foremost priority and reason to exist is to build transit for the region. But once we're able to complete that, then we can do the TOD. And so we try to make those connect as best we can. So those are just two of the goals I wanted to highlight for you tonight. So I think with that, I will pass it on to Thatcher, who will talk a little more about some of the specific requirements. And really, Thatcher actually is the manager of our implementation team that actually brings a TOD project to market and to life. So with that, I will turn it over to Thatcher.
Thank you, Tim, Mayor and council members. Sound Transit is a TOD policy, but we also have to implement state statute. State Statute 81-112-350 in particular was enacted with the approval of ST3, and with it, it contained a requirement for our surplus property that many commonly refer to as 80-80-80, which is really that 80% of our surplus property that is suitable for the development of housing must be first offered to qualified entities to create affordable housing. And if those entities accept the property, that at least 80% of the units created on that property is affordable to those earning no more than 80% of area median income for the county. Now, a qualified entity is defined in statute as a local jurisdiction, a housing authority, or a nonprofit developer. And the statute gave us a new tool that we didn't previously have, which is if someone takes property under to the terms that I just kind of outlined, we can discount property from fair market value. Now, the statute also requires the agency to implement a regional equitable TOD strategy. And Sound Transit is a signatory to PSRC's Growing Transit Communities. Additionally, Sound Transit adopted an equitable TOD policy in April of 2018 that talked about how we implement both the statute, the language that we contained within ST3 about what we're trying to achieve with our program, and went on to kind of talk about how Sound Transit has a commitment to supporting growth in designated growth centers, incorporating urban design and TOD thinking into the transit project development and design process, as well as using our agency's surplus property to advance equitable outcomes, and doing so through engagement both with jurisdictions and local communities. Now, I'm going to describe our kind of typical process, recognizing that with each property, there is a whole set of context-specific dynamics that are going on, whether it's our relationship with the jurisdiction or specific aspects of the property, the way it's laid out, our Sound Transit's ongoing relationship to the property, because we oftentimes have adjacent facilities. So every process looks slightly different as we cater to the unique aspects of the property. Well, the typical process first starts out with assessing the opportunity and what opportunities we might have. So right now, this is where Federal Way Link Extension is at, where we're working with the potential design builders on the way the station will lay out and what opportunities we might have for potential surplus property once construction staging is complete. Additionally, during this phase, we often are talking to jurisdictions about kind of big picture goals of what they're trying to achieve in station areas. But once we have identified that there will be an opportunity, we really kind of going into defining it. We start with trying to understand what are the physical bounds of the property, what's the size, its orientation, what is Sound Transit's ongoing needs. Maybe we have an adjacent station and we need to be able to get access through part of the property. And then we really develop a project management plan for how we're going to move this property to market. What kind of technical expertise we might need to bring on. Do we need to do market feasibility analysis? Do we need to look at some sort of structural component of our adjacent facilities and its impact on the property? We also want to conduct meaningful engagement with the community and local jurisdiction to keep everyone informed of how our decision making looks like, but also to receive input into what the goals should be for the property. We recognize that there's been a lot of work that predates us on what a community is trying to achieve, and it's through its comp plan or sometimes through station area plans. And so we want to recognize that the work we're doing is building off of work that's taken place previously. But additionally, we recognize that public property in a station area is uniquely positioned to try to achieve public outcomes beyond returning value to an agency. And so we work closely to try to figure out how our property works within that context to achieve local goals. And then depending on what those goals are, we might try to align public funding or other resources. So for example, where affordable housing is a goal, we often try to work with affordable housing funders to see if there's an alignment of funds prior to going out and trying to bring on a development partner. Now, all this work during the definition phase really leads us to trying to define what we're trying to do in our request for proposals, or the process that we use to bring on a development partner who will actually develop the end product. That kind of plan articulates what is the actual mechanism? Is it a request for proposals, a request for qualifications? How are we going to approach this 80-80-80 requirement in the statute, as that it applies easier at certain scales than on other scales, so large development sites that have multiple buildings that could get developed. We have to interpret the statute differently than if it is one piece of property where you could achieve one outcome or maybe two outcomes. And then also, how are we going to price the property? Again, as I mentioned earlier, the statute change now allows us to discount property for affordable housing. So where we have affordable housing as a goal, we need to engage our board about how we price the property. From there, we go on to bring on our partner, and we negotiate our agreements. Now, we're interested, again, as I mentioned, in developing or delivering projects that are additive to communities, that are achieving local goals for station areas. And so to maintain our leverage in making sure that we can actually deliver that, we often hold on to our property and don't sell it or lease it until the point of time where a developer's gotten their permits approved by the city, by the time that they've found the financing necessary to construct their project, as we don't want to close on property only to have it sit vacant and not see the development actually occur. Additionally, we make sure before we close on the property that the things that they said they were going to do, those public outcomes that they promised us, are actually going to be delivered. And again, we are committed to working with local jurisdictions throughout our process, as we recognize the importance of these properties in the context of the larger station area. And so our project won't be successful if the local jurisdiction is not in agreement to what we're trying to achieve. Now, I'm going to walk through a few examples of what we have achieved with our TOD portfolio. This project at the Federal Way Transit Center was our first TOD project and was constructed in 2009. And Korean Women's Association was our partner, who developed 62 units of senior affordable housing. The Mercy Othello project is in the Othello Station area of Seattle, and Mercy Housing opened 108 units of affordable housing in 2017. This project included street-level commercial space of about 7,200 square feet. That was a local priority, but it was not necessarily something that we were sure that could be delivered through the market. And so this was a case where we required the developer include this kind of space, and we worked with them to try to make sure that they could develop a property that would meet those needs, but also recognize that the retail market wasn't there. And so ultimately, the developer put their office space there, but built it with a storefront system so that it can be converted to retail without much cost in the future as the market becomes stronger. Now, our operations and maintenance facility east in Bellevue in the Spring District is something that we've been working closely with the city of Bellevue for many years at how we can create a large TOD opportunity between our operation and maintenance facility and the developing Spring District station. We have a result of about over 6.5 acres of TOD space that is entitled for 1.1 million square feet of development. The development rights were secured through the design build process and represented one way to achieve a mixed income, mixed use vision for the site. Right now, we are working with the city of Bellevue on what goals we're going to include in our RFP process, as there's desire by both Sound Transit and the city of Bellevue to explore whether or not there's a way to achieve either more or deeper affordability than what was identified in the master development permit that ultimately entitled the site. Now, the city, in this particular case, is very interested in achieving a high level of density across the site. and a mix of uses. And so we are trying to figure out how to, where we have 6 buildings on the site, how do we apply the 80-80-80 statute in a way that results in the vision that has been being developed for years. And so in this case, we're looking to develop a strategy that we'd be bringing both to our board, but has been heavily vetted both through the development community and through the city council. Now, it also represents a larger master development opportunity for the agency, which we haven't done a lot. Capitol Hill, which was mentioned earlier, was our first multi-building site that the agency has had. But as we continue to move further from the Seattle business core, we're starting to get more larger tracks where we can achieve district-wide goals on individual sites. And so how do we try to achieve, again, mixed income, mixed use outcomes where there are goals? In the case of Bellevue, Bellevue wanted to try to find 1.2 million square feet of space. And so this development plan includes about 660,000 square feet of office space and about a little over 500 units of housing. And so we have a lot more that we're trying to figure out as we move forward, and we'll have more on this particular project later this year. Now, bringing it back to Federal Way Transit Center, we're really at kind of the beginning of this process. As Tim alluded to earlier, later this year we'll have a much better idea of what our property is going to look like and what may be surplus towards the end of the project, of the construction. And so we're committed to working with you, the city, when we're coming up with the vision and goals for the development of on any property that we have, that when we develop our strategy of how we're going to take those properties out to market, that we're working closely with the city. And additionally, how can the city participate in our request for proposals to bring on a partner? That is something that we recently have, we did successfully with the city of Seattle at our Roosevelt property, and something that we're looking to do with the city of Bellevue on the OMF East. And we're committed to doing with the city of Federal Way here at the Federal Way Transit Center. Now, what does our implementation process generally look like? We've already kind of completed most of the assessment process, and we're really moving into the definitions phase. And it's really a kind of a 2-year process. Sometimes it can go a little longer depending on the amount of effort and kind of when do we start the clock, so to speak. But generally speaking, we're trying to come up with what our implementation strategy. What is it going to take for us to get smart about these properties so we can make informed decisions? And then how do we engage both the community and the city in the goal-setting process? And so that's a little between a 2 and a 2.5-year process, because we're starting these processes much earlier than we used to in the past. In the past, we waited until we surplused a property at the very end before we started having the conversations about what we were trying to achieve. Now we recognize that communities bear the brunt of construction for many years, and for us to then bring on a TOD developer after the fact and have a period of time where this land is sitting vacant before we start construction on a TOD is just something that a lot of communities don't want. So after we have defined the goals, our process to bring on a developer and then have them go through the permitting process and financing process and then construct it, that is another between 2 and 4 year process. So what that looks like is that as we kind of move forward, we'll continue to engage stakeholders. We're going to maintain flexibility to make sure that we don't create a set of guidelines for our program that does not allow us to respond to the local condition. But we're really going to start working on preparing the TOD sites for development. And so what that looks like is that starting later this year in 2019 and going into 2020, we'll be exploring the potential development outcomes for the site and preparing our TOD implementation strategy. And then starting later in 2020 and going into 2021, we'll be really getting smart on the properties in terms of due diligence, what kind of environmental conditions we might have to deal with, what kind of the market dynamics and things that we might need to overcome to achieve our goals. And then starting in 2021, the engagement process around the goals. From 2021 to 2023, we really will start doing the TOD RFP, bringing on a developer. So again, they can start doing their design and permitting and financing prior to the property being available to them to start construction. So that way we can try to minimize the amount of time on the back end when the staging of the transit project is done and the TOD developer can start. And so hopefully, again, as we get clarity as to when the design builder will be off the property, we'll be able to give a little bit more specificity to when the property will be available. And with that, we're looking forward to working with you as we go forward, and that concludes our presentation.
Councilor Duclos?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I know that you're going to have to displace some businesses, is that correct?
I think I'm going to have Tim join me for this part of the presentation.
Yes, so as part of the Federal Way construction, yes.
And you'll be paying for them to, if they move, you'll pay for their relocation?
Yes, so there is a complicated or involved process to acquire the properties and then relocate. Yeah.
Would they relocate in Federal Way or out of the city? Do you have anything on that, or any experience when you've been doing it?
That's a great question. Zach, do you want to join us? So this is Zach Eskenazi, who's a member of the project team that's actually working on
Hi,
the
Zach.
transit project. You may know him. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So your question was in regards to where the businesses are relocating?
Yeah.
So for the business relocation program, it's actually up to the individual business to decide where they'll relocate. Sound Transit offers assistance through a relocation agent to help a business navigate the process. What we've heard from a lot of the businesses that were relocating in the Federal Way Transit Center area is that they do in fact want to stay in the Federal Way market, so we'll help support that goal of those business owners too.
Thank you, that was my concern, would they
Okay.
stay here?
Yeah, I've heard that the majority are wanting to stay in the Federal Way Transit, or the Federal Way area market. Mhm.
Well, we'd like them in Federal Way. Thank you.
Councilmember Johnson, then the Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What is the data that has been collected throughout the other projects that is most business sense or been the most beneficial community or agency TOD, so the Seattle projects or CTAC?
So, I might not fully understand the question, but, I think we've done a number of different things when we've had a specific agency TOD opportunity. So, both at Capitol Hill and in Roosevelt, we went through an involved process of engaging with community members to try to identify the goals of what we're trying to achieve with the property. In the case of Capitol Hill, we heard very loudly from the local community about how they wanted space for small businesses. And so we try to work with the local community to kind of identify what kind of goals. In the case of Roosevelt, we engaged the community around kind of four larger principles. One was, what is the street level space? What does that look like in terms of business use? The city had a requirement for business storefront space, and so are we trying to direct the market to try to respond to certain needs? And in that process, we did provide them with data that one of our consultants put together that kind of looked at what is the market for different types of uses, so that people could have more of an informed decision about where their dollars are leaving the community. So where are they having to leave the community to spend their dollars, and maybe those uses would be appropriate here, as well as can those uses afford to pay to be in these neighborhoods. And additionally, we heard through the community group itself that did some research into the kind of macro trends that were taking place to small business districts and the displacement that was happening from a lot of teardowns of smaller buildings that the private market were doing, and whether or not there was an opportunity for us to try to create smaller spaces that maybe some of those businesses would have a chance to move into. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, part of it, and I guess more of it is around, like, since those stations have been put in place, has there been data collected around what's worked best in the past year or 2 years, I guess, in some cases, for those particular businesses? Because what we don't want, obviously, is business turnover, so some businesses to be there for a while and then leave just because it's not working. So is there any data that's been collected since then?
I think we'll have to look into that and get back to you on that one. I don't specifically know the answer to that.
All right. The Deputy Mayor, Councilmember Moore, and then Councilmember Assefa Dawson.
Thank you. On one of your maps, you showed 4 potential places for TOD here in Federal Way. Was there,
This was a previous design from the preliminary engineering, and I'll let Zach answer the rest of that.
Hello again. So this here is a concept of at about a 30% level of design. So as you can see, there will be an elevated station there along 23rd Avenue South. And there's a parking garage, a 400-stall parking garage that will be constructed as part of the project, and then the existing Federal Way Transit Center garage will remain. We are at a 30% design. We do still have to go through a final design. So that footprint could slightly change during final design, and there will be opportunities for the council and the community to see the design evolve. So in the end, there will be surplus property, but it might not be those exact spaces. But for what we know today, that is the layout, and that is what it would look like.
so 80% of that then should be housing?
Not necessarily. So what we've kind of identified with the statute is that, 80 doesn't apply well to large sites. There's a question of, we go through a process, and I think that's what we're really trying to say to you is that there are a lot of goals that need to get identified, and that not all property is suitable for housing. And then from there's a question about how do you right-size what we're trying to achieve. So for example, if hypothetically there were 4 sites that you could build 800 units of housing, that's a lot of housing. And so there's a question about whether or not you could realize 80% of those units at 80% AMI below, or whether or not you should. And so what we're trying to say is that we recognize that local communities have goals that are, for station areas that typically encompass multiple uses, and that within that, we have discrete pieces of property that fit within context to the local plan. And so when we go through our process, which we haven't started yet, we'd be looking at how do these properties, whatever properties they end up being, fit within, are some of them more suited for commercial uses? What are the local goals that have been already been articulated through zoning processes or station area plans? And then what should our strategy look like to try to achieve those goals? And, we're trying to take an approach, and our policy articulates this, that we take a flexible approach because every site is unique, and that we don't want to take a kind of one-size-fits-all policy application.
Okay, and I don't know if I understood you, but I thought I heard you say in 2021 you would be getting the property ready for development. Did I not hear that right?
That's correct. Starting in 2021, we would be prepping our RFP. Is the current tentative schedule. I mean, again, until we have the design builder on board and we have articulated when the design builder would be off the property, we kind of work backwards from the date that we would get possession for TOD, and then identify when the appropriate time to take it to market. Ultimately, we want to try to time it right. Goals for properties change over time, and so we want to make sure that we're having that conversation right before we finalize the goals that we put into the RFP and then bring a developer on. So 2021 is the beginning of when we do an RFP.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Moore.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. First, I want to say, I'm trying to remember your name.
Thatcher.
Thatcher, there you go. Thatcher, I know you've repeated yourself countless times, and I just want to say thank you for stating the fact that you guys are going to be willing to work with us on our vision of our downtown, and how does that work into the big play? How does that work into the plan for surplus properties? So if I'm not mistaken, that's what I heard. And that is really, really, really important to me, and I'm sure to others, and perhaps to residents, that Sound Transit doesn't just come here and build their own stuff and whatever they want, that it has to fit into our plan. What have we worked for such a long time to develop in our community here? And so I just want to say that I appreciate hearing you say that. Thank you. It was brought to my attention, obviously, I just drove past the downtown Denny's and, kind of as a shock factor of, okay, it's really happening. There's no more sign, there's not a sign on Denny's anymore and whatnot, and you've obviously, or somebody stated that other businesses have closed now. So with that being said, how are you guys securing the properties and ensuring that there's no negative attention that's being created immediately, not later, not a couple days later, but immediately? That's my first question. I have another question, Mayor.
And I think right next to it, the ARCO is empty as well.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for that question. When we do take possession of a property, it goes over to our property management department at Sound Transit. They have a program in place to secure and monitor properties that we own. And they also patrol any properties, and they'll be responsive to any issues that develop. They have a process in place to escalate the different ways in which they secure a property if they start having reoccurring problems with that property. So originally, they'll probably start out with just locking the property up. If it starts to get worse, they would fence it. And we have open lines of communication with your staff at the City of Federal Way that we work with, and that help us be more responsive to issues that arise.
Okay, so with some of the buildings that have closed, has that already begun?
Yes, that has. Yeah, we are in possession of those properties, and we are managing them.
Okay, because I think that, speaking for myself, that's important because, as you can imagine, any property that becomes vacant, things happen that shouldn't be happening with it. So now you talked about, I'm trying to keep track of names.
Oh yeah, this is Zach.
Right.
Tim.
Ted. I think Ted is the one that mentioned perhaps about businesses that have left. Can we dig a little bit deeper? What does this mean? I mean, they're talking about Federal Way. Which businesses are you talking about? I just wanted to get a little bit more details on that.
Right. We can have our real property agent contact you and give you a fuller, deeper update of that. The properties that we are talking about are like the ARCO, as you mentioned, the Denny's, Wendy's, Sound Credit Union, Washington Federal, and then the businesses, Deseret Industry, New World Market, and the businesses associated in that building there. So those are the businesses that are being relocated as part of the station staging and construction needs.
I'd like to,
we can have our real property agent reach out to you and give you a more fuller update to where we are in that process.
And I assume you're staying in contact with our economic development director or somebody.
Yes. Oh yeah. We work closely with Tony.
Are you trying to relocate them in Federal Way?
Excuse me?
Are you trying to locate the businesses that have to move in Federal Way?
Right. As I said earlier, it is up to the business to decide where they relocate. It's their decision, but they have signaled to us, many of those businesses have signaled to us they do in fact want to stay in the Federal Way market.
Councilmember Sepa Dawson, and then Councilmember Kopech.
Thank you. First of all, I want to shout out to Soraya, my former coworker. Good to see you here. My question is, I always understood that surplus property or the properties would be surplus, and now it sounds like it's up to the board to decide what happens, or I just wanted clarification on that.
Yes. So for most properties, there's a very specific process that we must follow in close coordination with the FTA. And so we buy a lot of our properties with federal money, and so we have to have a process in place about how do we dispose of our property that does become surplus. And so as a part of the board's fiduciary responsibilities, they have to declare a property as surplus over a certain value, and so most TOD sites exceed that value. And so what we've been doing, historically the agency took an approach which was we buy property, we use it to build facilities, and then we open the light rail line or whatever facility, the bus facility, and then we kind of reappraise what we got, and we realize that we've got some property that's no longer necessary and might be considered excess. Then we can take the step further of saying, well, we don't even envision in the future needing this for transit, so we can surplus it. We would take an action to our board, who would then approve it, and then we would go out and try to dispose of the property, typically through an RFP. What we have tried to be is more strategic, and so we are now earlier in the process identifying when we think, once we're done with staging construction, we can identify what property we won't need in the future, and so we will go to our board much earlier in the process, often while we're still using the property, and say, once we are done with the property, we will essentially contingently surplus the property. And so once we certify in the future that we're done with the property, then it's available for us to transfer it over to a developer who's essentially leasing or buying it from us. And so that allows us to reduce the overall time it takes to go from a condition where we don't have any transit facilities to us having both an operational transit facility and some of the vision for the station area completed. So we can kind of trim down the timeline. But it is a board action.
So does that mean they could decide for it to not be surplused out? Or
It's the board's decision as to whether or not they want to surplus an asset, yes. But what we're trying to do as an agency is articulate that, we have a role beyond just being the T in TOD, being the transit in TOD, and we have a role in facilitating station development. And so as we do recognize opportunities where we only need that land for staging purposes, we are trying to actively pipeline that, articulate that in such and such date, we will no longer need that property, and that we should be starting now to think about both what does that process look like and how do we bring on a partner sooner, so that way, again, we can minimize the amount of time it takes for the ultimate station vision to be realized. So the board is taking, they have the final say as it relates to our work, but that work has to be informed through a collaborative process. Our TOD policy talks very much about how important engagement is, both of the local communities and the local jurisdictions, and quite frankly, in my experience in implementing projects, if you don't have a local jurisdiction aligned with what you're trying to do, then you won't have success. There's a lot of development opportunities in this region, and developing agency property is more complicated and takes longer and takes more resources from a partner. And so the more that we can do to streamline that process and minimize their risk, the more likely we're going to find success. And so that's really what we've been focusing on over the last number of years, is trying to refine our practice so that we can try to develop a proper project that more widely is seen as successful.
Councilor Kopeng.
Thank you, Mayor. We're going to be partners for a long time. I think the city of Federal Way and ST is going to be linked together at 3 different locations in the city. And I think the site we're looking at now is really, it's right in the middle of our downtown. And I think people can hear the presentation, hearing the worst or hearing the best. The worst, it's all multifamily housing, doesn't have the services to support it, creates new problems. The best is everything's going to be perfect, and everything's going to be fine, right? And I think in between is really where we're going to end up, okay? And I guess the question I have is, what exactly does that process look like? Especially when we're talking about it starting in 2021, as far as putting the RFP together. When does the city start having some engagement with Sound Transit on what that RFP should look like from our perspective? If you could flesh that out a little bit for me, I'd appreciate it, and for the rest of the community.
Sure. So as was kind of mentioned, is through the rest of this year, we're really working on finalizing the design of the station and starting construction. And with that, we'll kind of emerge really what are the opportunities we have. And so really starting later this year, fall, and then into next year, we will be really scoping what does our work plan look like. We kind of hinted at what our typical processes look like, but I agree, we need to define what it looks like so that people understand who's making decisions and when, and what information is needed to be complete to inform those decisions. And so a lot of our work between now and 2021 is both defining process, so some of that will be, what does engagement look like in Federal Way? What does it look like as it relates to us and the city as an entity, and then what does it look like between Sound Transit and the city and community stakeholders? And additionally, we often do some work around, trying to get, I think I called it being smart about the property, but essentially trying to understand both what would the market do today, but also trying to figure out what, if there's a vision that either exists or we can refine over the next 2 years, what is it going to take to realize that vision? One of the pieces that really needs to go into our plan, our implementation plan, is time. If we end up with multiple sites, we might have multiple opportunities to realize different outcomes, and time plays a role in the sense that if achieving the vision is really important, the specific vision, and the market won't deliver it today, is it worth waiting? And so we kind of want to have that. It's really important for us not to make assumptions and go through a process and then have something blow up. And so our intent is to try to understand the dynamics that are playing out in the property, and then what is making sure that everybody feels comfortable with the process we're using. And then we really factor in the time piece. But again, I don't know exactly what it is that we have, and I don't know what your goals are specifically.
Right. But you will.
But we will.
Yes.
And by 2021,
Okay.
our goal is to make sure that we're in alignment
Okay.
on those goals in our
I
process.
think Federal Way wants its downtown to be its downtown, not Sound Transit's. I think we could all understand that. So I think we want to be good partners, but we want to be a part of informing the process as opposed to watching the train leave the station without us. So,
Noted.
okay, all right, thank you.
Great rail metaphors. Alignment, leaving the station, well done, well done.
It's just effortless.
Exactly. Okay, council, any other comments or questions? Councilmember Moore.
Just a comment for us, pretty much, if that's okay? I just wanted to just continue to reiterate, I know I mentioned this last time we were talking about Sound Transit, but it's really important that as we begin the process, and as buildings get taken over, or whatever you want to call it, I really think that communication is really important with the public. And when construction actually starts, I really think, again, communication is really important with the public so that everybody gets, so to speak, a heads up that this is happening. Change is happening. It's going to be frustrating, but it's going to be a beautiful outcome. So I don't know who's in charge of doing that. Maybe Sound Transit is in charge of doing that. Maybe we both are working on it, but I really want to push for there to be a clear line of communication with the public and signage saying that be ready, be prepared, this is what's going to happen well in advance to before construction starts. So that's just my comment I'm going to continue to share.
Very good. Councilmember.
Well, being chair of the Finance Committee and having worked and run places, I'm concerned about the loss of income that we may have from the businesses that are going to be displaced. And so I want us to keep a real vigilant eye out on that.
Very good. Council, anything else? All right, just to make sure the trains run on time, I think we want to move over to public comment now. Thank you. We've got Dana Holloway. And if anybody else would like to speak at this study session, please submit a sheet. This is the only one I have. Ms. Holloway.
Good evening. Mayor, Deputy Mayor, council members, city staff, and fellow residents. My name is Dana Holloway, and I am concerned that the city will not be proactive and prepared for Sound Transit 3 activity. I'm really glad to see what we saw tonight, but like you said in the questions you've asked, there's a lot of unknowns, and it's going to happen real fast. I heard tonight that the city needs to define goals for the TOD, and I really hope that you don't have to leave that up to Tony, that'll be what you will be doing with citizen involvement. Sound Transit is going to have a big impact on Federal Way, and that can either be a positive or a negative. It's up to you as our elected officials to ensure the city takes the necessary steps and actions now and not 2 or 3 years from now. I'm glad to hear that they are now changing how they get us involved much earlier than previously. I was a little bit upset when I started researching this that it wasn't until 2015 or 2016 that they started the 80-80-80. They only wanted to start doing the affordable housing into it at that point in time forward, which is Sound Transit 3. Sound Transit 1 and 2, they didn't do that. My concern is revenue, and we know that on affordable housing, the developers get a tax incentive not to pay property tax for up to 10 to 12 years. That's a lot of money that we could be losing. I would like to see market rate, and when they say mixed incomes, well, I keep hearing the 80-80-80, and that makes me very, very nervous. We also need to have a short, mid, and long-term timeline for the city for 10, 20, even 50 years out. There's a lot going on. Sound Transit is affecting us from 272nd downtown all the way down to Kingdom, maybe the OMF. We have businesses leaving, maybe relocating, hopefully. We also have the WashDOT is going to be affecting us with construction. So I'm really concerned that there's much is happening to us, and you guys have to really be engaged yourselves, not leaving it up to staff. And I really hope that I think there's enough people that are residents that would like to also be involved. A vision, we need to have a controlled and managed growth plan. I think that's a complaint a lot of people have when they see how some of the apartments have been built in the past. And I'll end with a quote from Lewis Carroll. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dana. And then, all right, and well, we'll get it after you talk. Dana Noble-Gulliford.
Okay, thank you. Diana Noble-Gulliford, Federal Way. I've been watching and reading about this process, and I'm pleased to see that we're finally having a meeting here with council regarding it. I have a couple questions. Mr. Thatcher said that the surplus property will be sold to qualified entities. So it sounds to me like it's something that the surplus properties will not be placed on the open market. And I'm concerned, I'd like to know what those qualified property or entities are. They mentioned local and nonprofit, and from reading in the news about Sound Transit, I read that the Capitol Hill project, the property is on a 99-year lease. I don't know if you can correct me if I'm wrong. So the property is still in the hands of either a nonprofit or Sound Transit. It's not generating any property tax value. I'd like to see our surplus properties be returned to collect property tax. And then the strategy as far as separating the properties between agency and community from the private sector. I was concerned about that. And their process and how they define that. So as far as, well, we're in this phase right now where Denny's is boarded up and the gas station is vacant. I'm very concerned about how our city center looks, that it doesn't look trashed, that it definitely can be as secure and as pleasing visually to our city as possible. And I'm not sure chain link fencing is going to do it for me. Perhaps maybe we need to have some signage or some banners or some solid colors around the chain link fence that disclose that, hey, this is progress and looking forward to the construction in our community. But it doesn't look good, and I think we could do better. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Moore?
I just want to echo those words, and really, while Sound Transit's here, I think hopefully that last comment you guys heard, I think that's really critical and that's really important, because I think most of us have driven through cities where there's a massive amount of construction, and I think that's concerning. And so I really hope that maybe there's a solution or an idea that pops up that's innovative, outside the box thinking for that. So I have to continue to echo those words, former Councilmember Diana Noble-Gulliford on that, 'cause I think I'm really nervous about this, and I've already gotten reports that properties are getting negative attention. And maybe I'm wrong, but that's just what I'm hearing, so.
Deputy Mayor Honda?
Thank you. For Sound Transit, as you start construction, I imagine you need to put fencing up to keep the property secure and safe. And I was just wondering, after Diana spoke, could we have murals painted on the fencing? You know, put big pieces of wood or whatever and have murals painted along the way to make it interesting, and hopefully they won't be tagged, they'd be respected, and something other than just looking at ugly fencing and construction going on for years and years.
And/or one of the, remember when we were building Town Square Park, one of the things that we did at Town Square Park was we had signs about as big as that screen that said, that said what the plan was, that had a picture or, some sort of thing saying, this space will be used for a light rail station, or it's under construction. So what it doesn't look like is that we have a ghost town in our downtown. What I'm concerned about, I think everybody up here is concerned about, is, now the Arco is closed, the Denny's is closed. That Denny's has been there 30, 40 years, maybe longer. Having that sit empty, or a cyclone fence for the next 2 years with nothing in front of it, is frankly completely and absolutely unacceptable. So in our corridor. So one of the things I'll be doing tomorrow is reaching out, to Sound Transit folks and talk about what the plan is to make sure that our corridor to our downtown is not blighted. Please.
Thank you. I'm Soraya Larry. I'm with the project team as well. And thank you so much for all your questions and comments. We'll be taking them all back. And in particular, in regard to the comment about putting some screening or art enhancements at key locations, we are already talking with our art department on looking on that. And so we'll be working very closely with Tony and can provide ongoing updates. But we really appreciate understanding where the greatest sensitivities are so we can target our efforts most effectively.
All right. Great. Thank you very much. All right, anything else? Deputy Mayor?
As buildings become empty in this area, when do you take them down? Do you take them all down at one time, or are they taken down as they become empty?
So the plan for demolition will be undertaken by our design builder when they come on board. That work would likely start at the end of the year or early 2020. We probably will not close on all those properties at the same time. We won't. Some will close earlier than others, like you've noticed, the Denny's and Arco, but some, like the Wendy's, is still in business. So as they close and when our design builder's on board, they will have a demolition program in place. So what you'll see is us trying to secure the properties according to our process, and we'll be able to secure them hopefully in a way that's aesthetically pleasing. And then when they all come down and we have more of a blank slate, that's when we can get into fencing the entire area and applying some temporary artwork to that as well. So you'll see involvement as the project starts to get underway.
Great news. Thank you. Got great additional information. Councilmember Sepidawson?
Yeah, quick question. Who determines when they close? The businesses themselves?
We work closely with the businesses to understand their needs. We do have a deadline in which we do need to have them closed. Ideally, we would close by the end of this year, but we do understand that some businesses need more time than others. So we work individually with each business to help them understand when they need to close and other things to take into consideration.
So by 2019, end of 2019?
Well, that's the goal, but some of these businesses might stay open a little bit longer into 2020, depending on their needs.
Deputy Mayor?
Could you just clarify for me? We have 2 empty buildings right now, and they're going to stay up and empty until the design builder is on board. Correct. And makes a plan for taking the... So these buildings could stay up and empty for a year, 2 years, or?
Probably not that long. Currently, we're seeing that heavy construction will likely start in early 2020. We don't have a design builder on board yet, so we don't have an exact plan. However, they won't be up for 2 years. It's because we need that area for staging. That's probably one of the first areas in which the design builder will start demolition. Again, I can't speak exactly to the schedule because we don't have one yet, because we don't have that person on board. But it's like they won't sit there for 2 years. That's not going to happen. It'll be in the next 6 to 8 months, I would say.
Okay.
And we'll keep you updated as it progresses. We can keep your staff updated as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Kopech.
Yeah, one more quick question from me. Because there's going to be more information around this, I'm sure, but we'll have businesses that are going to continue to operate across the street. And what are we going to be doing to make sure that their impact is as minimal as possible? I think dust control, sound, all that. What are the measures that are going to be put in place for them?
So we have a pretty robust engagement plan. Our community outreach representative, Jefferson Rose, has already begun engaging businesses that will remain open during construction. So we have a robust toolkit that we use to help businesses navigate our construction. And so I can get you in touch with him to provide you a little bit more updates on how we engage those businesses and what that toolkit looks like. But we do have a toolkit in place.
Tony, I think that may be a good topic for a future conversation. It's just for the council to understand, or for the community more importantly to understand, the impacts and how they're going to be controlled or reduced by Sound Transit.
Right, and there's a community outreach plan that will be in development, and our community outreach team will work closely with the city and the community to help understand and navigate the impacts from our project.
And just to add to that, in terms of actual management on the ground, the design build contractor will be required to have a maintenance of traffic plan, engagement plans, site management plans. So they'll be closely looking at impacts to the community. They're required to diagram that all out, and the city will be involved in reviewing those plans.
All right. I think you're hearing our real sensitivity about leaving those businesses too long. I think all of us up here and in the community would be very concerned about, especially as more close, that'll be a very poor reflection on our city. And so we want to make sure that that's addressed as soon as possible. Council, anything else? Actually, thank you so much for your responsiveness to those questions. Actually, just actually hearing those really clarified some points, and I was very concerned about a 2-year time frame for those sitting, and that I think concerned everybody up here. Thank you very much. A very thorough presentation. Thank you. Okay, and then we'll follow up and make sure that there's constant contact. A great presentation today. All right, and so that concludes the study session. We have executive session pursuant to RCW 4230-1101I. We will be in recess for that purpose, and our regular meeting starts at 6:30, so the maximum duration of executive session will be 25 minutes. We're in recess for that purpose. Thank you.